think there were not many people who understood just how broad his interests were and how supportive he was of an astonishingly wide range.
For more than 70 years, they were the faces of a nation. A king and queen who stood side by side through wars, crises, and the relentless gaze of the world. But in 2017, something changed. Prince Philip, the man who had walked 2 steps behind his wife for 6 decades, made a decision that left the public stunned. He moved out of Buckingham Palace, and he did not return. For years, the question lingered. Why would a husband of 70 years choose to live apart from the queen he had devoted his life to?
There were not many people who understood just how broad his interests were and how supportive he was of an astonishingly wide range.
Was it a personal rift, a hidden scandal, or was there a reason far more ordinary and far more human than anyone imagined? Now, members of his own family, Princess Anne, King Charles, and Prince Andrew have finally spoken, and the truth is not what most people expected. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand exactly why Philip left the palace, and you'll see one of the most extraordinary royal marriages in history in a completely different light. But before we go any further, let me ask you something. Could you spend 70 years in the shadow of someone you love? Could you watch your own ambitions quietly fade while you supported someone else's destiny? That question sits at the heart of everything that follows. It began, improbably, with a wedding in 1934. Princess Elizabeth of York was 8 years old. She met a 13-year-old Greek prince named Philip. At the time, it meant nothing, just 2 children at a family gathering. But 5 years later, everything changed. In 1939, the royal family visited the Britannia Royal Naval College in Dartmouth. A young cadet was tasked with entertaining the princesses. His name was Philip. He was 18, athletic, restless, full of an energy that would define the rest of his life. He played croquet, he vaulted over tennis nets, he showed off the way 18-year-olds do. And 13-year-old Elizabeth fell for him completely. She would later say that from that day forward, she never had eyes for anyone else. It seems almost impossible that a teenage crush could go on to shape the destiny of a nation. But in Elizabeth's case, it did. Philip was serving in the Royal Navy during the war when the letters began. Elizabeth kept his photograph in her bedroom. She wrote to him while he was at sea. When he returned, the relationship deepened. In 1946, he proposed. But here's what most people don't realize. He wasn't the king's first choice. King George VI had real doubts. His daughter was young. She had only ever loved one man. Was she too inexperienced to trust her own heart? And Philip himself faced resistance from every direction. Too direct, too unconventional, too foreign, Greek, German, Danish. Not in the eyes of the establishment English enough. Elizabeth would not be moved. In July 1947, the engagement was announced, and Philip made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He renounced his Greek and Danish titles. He became a British citizen. He adopted the surname Mountbatten. He joined the Church of England. He gave up his entire identity for love. On the 20th of November, 1947, they married at Westminster Abbey. For a while, life was almost ordinary. Philip, still a naval officer, was posted to Malta. Elizabeth joined him. They raised their young children, Charles and then Anne, in something close to a normal military household. They were, by every account, happy. But that ordinary life was never going to last. In February 1952, King George VI died suddenly. Elizabeth was 25, Philip was 30. And in an instant, everything they had quietly assumed they still had time for vanished. Elizabeth became queen, and Philip discovered something no one had fully prepared him for. He would not become king. His naval career, The one thing he had trained for, excelled at, genuinely loved was over. From this moment on, his entire identity would be defined by his wife's position, not his own. Years later, he'd admit he had once believed he'd have a long career at sea. It soon became obvious there was no hope. He had to compromise. And the compromise was only beginning. Because almost immediately, a deeply personal battle broke out, not over affairs of state, but over something far more basic. A name. Philip's uncle, Lord Mountbatten, declared that the House of Mountbatten now reigned in England, implying Elizabeth's children would carry her husband's surname. Queen Mary and Winston Churchill firmly disagreed. The dynasty, they insisted, would remain the House of Windsor. Philip was furious. He is said to have called himself a bloody amoeba, the only man in the country not permitted to pass his own name to his children. A small detail, but it revealed something enormous. Underneath the coronation gowns and the palace formality, a much more human struggle was unfolding. A husband quietly fighting to understand what his identity even meant, inside a marriage where his wife now outranked him completely. That struggle would define the next 70 years. In 1960, Elizabeth compromised. The family surname would be Mountbatten-Windsor. But Philip never forgot the sting of it. He had given up everything for his wife, and in the eyes of the establishment, he was still, in some sense, an outsider. So he set out to build a role for himself. He once told a journalist he was often perceived as little more than a refugee husband. He said that when he asked people what was actually expected of him as royal consort, they simply looked back at him blankly. No one knew. There was no job description. So Philip wrote his own. He pushed to modernize a monarchy he feared could otherwise become, in his words, a museum piece. He championed the televised broadcast of the coronation itself, against fierce resistance from traditionalists convinced it would cheapen the ceremony. More than 20 million people tuned in. He was right, and the monarchy was never quite the same again. He encouraged the televised Christmas broadcast. He brought the first documentary cameras into royal life. He abolished the outdated presentation of debutantes at court, replacing it with informal garden parties. He was, by several accounts, the first royal to use a computer, writing his own emails, his own speeches. But behind every public success sat the same unresolved private question. Who was Prince Philip when he wasn't standing 2 steps behind the Queen? Elizabeth tried to include him, often using the phrase, "my husband and I," in public speeches. It became, in time, something of a national joke. But Philip was never simply a figurehead. In private, within family matters, he was very much the head of the household. In matters of state, though, he had no real say at all. And that line between the two was not always easy to walk. There were moments of real, human tension between them. One frequently told account describes Philip driving Elizabeth to Coworth Park, his speed making her visibly tense, until he finally snapped that if she gasped again, he'd put her out of the car. She composed herself. She said nothing further. But there were other moments, too, when it was Elizabeth who asserted herself, telling him sharply to be quiet, even in front of staff, leaving him to storm out of the room in frustration. A marriage, not a fairy tale. And then there were the rumors that followed Philip for decades. His flirtatious manner, his membership in the Thursday Club, his voyages aboard the royal yacht Britannia, all of it fueled speculation. He was linked over the years to a Russian ballerina, an English actress, a writer. None of it was ever confirmed. The palace consistently denied any suggestion of a rift. Philip himself responded with characteristic sarcasm, asking whether anyone had ever seen him go anywhere without a police escort at his side. One biographer suggested that after an alleged episode in the 1950s, Philip simply became more discreet, keeping his circles too elite for the tabloids to reach. What actually happened behind those closed doors, we may never know for certain. What we do know is this: whatever tensions existed, Philip's devotion to Elizabeth never publicly wavered. At their golden wedding anniversary, she described him in front of the nation as her strength and stay all these years. And then in 2017, everything changed. That May, Buckingham Palace confirmed Philip's retirement from public life. He completed his final engagement that August, at 96, with the Royal Marines. And then he did something that quietly stunned royal watchers. He didn't simply retire. He moved out. Philip relocated to Wood Farm, a modest cottage on the Sandringham estate, once home to Prince John, the youngest son of George V, who had lived there in quiet seclusion until his death in 1919. Why would a 96-year-old choose that particular house over the palace he'd occupied for decades? The answer, in his own words from a 2011 interview, was almost startlingly simple. He wanted finally to enjoy himself. The Queen fully supported the decision. She understood better than anyone alive exactly what he had sacrificed and for how long. But when Philip actually arrived at Wood Farm expecting quiet simplicity, he reportedly found a bus full of staff waiting for him. Cooks, telephonists, the full apparatus of royal life, following him even into retirement. Still, he made the most of it. He took up carriage driving, a new hobby suited to hands no longer capable of polo. He painted watercolors. He read history rather than fiction. For a while, he still drove himself until a car accident in January 2019 when his vehicle overturned near Sandringham. He was unharmed. The occupants of the other car were injured. 3 weeks later, at 97, he voluntarily surrendered his driving license. What was meant to be a short stay at Wood Farm quietly became permanent. He never moved back to the palace. And this is the point most retellings of this story get wrong. It wasn't collapse, it wasn't scandal. It was, by every credible account, something closer to a long overdue negotiation, finally reaching its conclusion. A man who had spent nearly 70 years subordinating his own identity to an institution, finally claiming one small, quiet corner of life that belonged only to him. He and the Queen spoke by telephone every day. She visited Wood Farm. He attended major family occasions, including his grandson Harry's wedding in 2018. They lived apart, but they had not in any real sense separated. Then came a twist almost no one could have predicted. In March 2020, as the world entered lockdown, Philip left Wood Farm and rejoined the Queen at Windsor Castle, inside what the household nicknamed, half-jokingly, HMS Bubble. After years of gradually building distance, a global pandemic brought them back under one roof. On the 22nd of July that year, Philip made his final public appearance, handing over his role as Colonel-in-Chief of the Rifles to Camilla. He would never appear publicly again. In February 2022, he was briefly hospitalized as a precaution, later undergoing a successful heart procedure. Quiet talk began of his 100th birthday. Philip, by most accounts, was not looking forward to it. Perhaps some part of him already knew he wouldn't reach it. On the 9th of April 2021, Prince Philip died at the age of 99, with the Queen at his side. The palace described it simply as a peaceful death. His will, unusually, was sealed for at least 90 years, a decision reportedly made to protect the dignity of the crown, fueling speculation, never confirmed, about what it might contain. In the aftermath, his children spoke. Princess Anne called him her teacher, her supporter, and, in her own words, her critic. She spoke of his rare gift for treating every person he met as an individual, regardless of their station. Charles praised what he called his father's remarkable devotion, across 70 years of service, not just to the Queen, but to the country and the wider Commonwealth. Andrew remembered a father who, whatever the public perception, cherished the time he spent with his family. A year later, Elizabeth spoke publicly of her enduring affection for Scotland and the memories she and Philip had built there together, words that, to many who heard them, carried the unmistakable weight of grief still quietly being carried. On the 8th of September 2022, Queen Elizabeth II died at the age of 96. She was laid to rest beside him. Two people who had spent the final years of a 70-year marriage living in some sense apart, now reunited permanently in the place built for them both. So now you know what actually happened. It wasn't a scandal, it wasn't a rift. It was a man who had spent 70 years in his wife's shadow, finally, in his final chapter, choosing solitude on his own terms. He chose freedom over formality, but he never stopped loving her, and she never stopped loving him. Their marriage was never a fairy tale. It was something more difficult and more real, a partnership forged by duty, tested by identity, and in the end, defined by a devotion that outlasted every private struggle along the way.